He was not a myth, he was not a legend, he was a king and a giant. Long after the flood, when giants were supposed to be gone, one ruler still walked the earth. His name was Og of Bashan. The Bible records his bed 9 feet long, his kingdom fortified and feared, his defeat final and absolute. But why was Og spared when other giants vanished? Why does Scripture emphasize his size, his land, and his death? And what does his story reveal about a forgotten war between heaven, earth, and humanity? Tonight, we uncover the mystery of the last giant king. Welcome back to Hidden Bible Mystery, where ancient scriptures, lost civilizations, and forbidden history meet. In the book of Deuteronomy, hidden among conquest narratives, lies a chilling detail. A giant king ruled east of the Jordan. His cities were massive, his power unmatched, and his bloodline not entirely human. This is not folklore. This is written scripture. Tonight, we journey into the land of Bashan, a region later associated with darkness, watchers, and rebellion. This is the story of Og of Bashan, the last known giant king to fall under divine judgment. Before we continue, if mysteries hidden in ancient texts fascinate you, subscribe to Hidden Bible Mystery. Like this video to help uncover more forgotten truths, and stay until the end, because Og's death was not just a battle, it was a spiritual cleansing. East of the Jordan River lies a land the Bible does not describe lightly, a land of high plateaus and volcanic stone, a land of ancient forests and fortified cities, a land whose very name would echo fear among Israel's enemies. This land was called Bashan. In Scripture, Bashan is not merely geography. It is a territory of power. Long before Israel crossed the Jordan, Bashan was already known for its strength. Its soil was rich, its cattle were legendary, its cities were built not of mud brick, but of black basalt, heavy and unyielding. But beneath its prosperity lay something far more disturbing. Bashan was the domain of the Rephaim. The Rephaim were not ordinary men. They were remembered as giants, survivors of an ancient bloodline that should have vanished in the flood. The Bible speaks of them carefully, almost cautiously, as if naming them was dangerous. Only Og, king of Bashan, was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. This single sentence changes everything. It tells us that Bashan was not just land, it was a refuge, a last stronghold for something ancient and forbidden. Geographically, Bashan sat at a crossroads between worlds. To the north rose Mount Hermon, a place later associated with divine rebellion and watchers descending from heaven. To the east stretched the wilderness, vast and untamed. To the west flowed the Jordan, symbol of covenant and divine promise. Bashan stood outside that promise. It was land not yet sanctified, land still under the shadow of pre-flood corruption. Ancient cities like Ashtaroth and Edrei were not small settlements. They were massive, fortified strongholds, built for beings of unusual size and strength. Their walls were thick, their gates enormous. These were not cities designed for ordinary men, and ruling over all of it was one King Og. The Bible does not introduce Og casually. It presents him as a figure already known, already feared. His kingdom was vast, his people loyal, his presence dominant. And most chilling of all, God commands Israel not to fear him, because fear was exactly what Bashan to produce. This land was not conquered by chance. It was targeted because Bashan was not just a kingdom of men. It was the last gateway of the giants. Music lowers, Porzibas, and at the center of this dark land stood a king whose very existence defied the judgment of the flood. The Bible does not call Og a giant by accident. It places him within a lineage that should not have survived. Og was king of Bashan, but more importantly, he was described as the last of the Rephaim. This word, Rephaim, is not casual language. It appears throughout Scripture, like a shadow, always connected to fear, death, and ancient power. Before the flood, giants were known as the Nephilim. After the flood, their names change, but their presence does not entirely disappear. The Rephaim were remembered as remnants, survivors of a corrupted bloodline that traced back to a time when the boundaries between heaven and earth were violated. How did they survive? The Bible does not explain it directly. Instead, it leaves clues. Some ancient traditions suggest that the flood destroyed the giants, but not their influence. Others believe that the corruption re-emerged through human lineage after the flood, repeating the same forbidden pattern. Scripture hints at this possibility when it says, "There were giants in the earth in those days," and also afterward. Og belonged to that afterward. He was not a wandering giant hiding in caves. He was a king organized, strategic, and ruling an advanced kingdom. That alone tells us something critical. Og was not just large in stature, he was large in authority. His people followed him. His cities were defended. His reign was stable. This suggests that the Rephaim were not monsters hunted into extinction. They were rulers, and Og was their last crowned king. The Bible connects Og to other giant clans, the Anakim, the Emim, and the Zamzummim, each described as peoples of great size and terrifying presence. But unlike them, Og remained. Why? Because Bashan was different. It was distant from Israel, distant from covenant, distant from judgment. Until the appointed time, Og's survival was not an accident, it was a delay, a final chapter in a story God intended to close. And when Israel approached Bashan, fear spread quickly through the camp. Moses records that God himself had to intervene, not because Israel was weak, but because Og represented something ancient, not merely a military threat, but a living reminder of a world God had already judged once. Og stood as proof that corruption could rise again if left unchecked. And so his bloodline mattered, not because of power, but because it crossed a line God never intended humanity to cross. Og was not just a giant king, he was the last evidence that the giants were real. Of all the details the Bible could have preserved about Og of Bashan, it chose one object, not his weapons, not his armor, not his victories. It recorded his bed. The book of Deuteronomy tells us, "For only Og king of Bashan remained of the remnant of the Rephaim. Behold, his bedstead was a bedstead of iron. 9 cubits was its length, and 4 cubits its breadth." This was not poetry. It was measurement 9 cubits long, 4 cubits wide. By ancient standards, this bed measured over 13 feet in length. And the Bible does something unusual here. It tells us where the bed was kept. It was placed in Rabbah of the Ammonites, on display. Why? Because this bed was evidence. Ancient kings exaggerated their power through art and myth. But Scripture does not rely on exaggeration. Instead, it preserves a physical object, something people could see, touch, and verify. This bed was not symbolic. Was-prune iron bed in the ancient world was almost unheard of, and was valuable and difficult to shape. Beds were typically made of wood or stone. Otto's bed was iron, not because of luxury, but because of way normal bed would not hold a king of such size. This was not ceremonial furniture, it was necessity. The Bible quietly tells us something terrifying was not remembered as Toi, was remembered as heavy. His size was real enough that future generations needed evidence to believe it, and so the bed remained displayed long after his death. a relic of a world that should not have existed. Some scholars suggest the bed was longer than Og himself, possibly ceremonial or exaggerated. Art scripture never says that. It simply gives the measurement and lets the reader decide. That silence is intentionally because the Bible does not try to convince skeptics. It records what happened. Og slept on iron because nothing else could support him. And in that iron frame lies a quiet warning. Giants were not stories whispered around campfires. They were rulers who left physical traces behind. And Og left one the size of a king. The bed of iron stands as a monument, not to power, but to judgment, because Og's strength did not save him. Og of Bashan did not rule tents and villages. He ruled cities. Scripture tells us that his kingdom contained 60 fortified cities, walled, barred, and heavily defended. This number is not symbolic. It is logistical. 60 cities require planning, supply lines, governance. Military structure. Og's kingdom was not chaos. It was organized power. The Bible describes these cities as having high walls, gates, and bars, a phrase repeated to emphasize strength. These were not temporary defenses. They were permanent fortresses. Many of these cities were built from basalt stone, black volcanic rock, native to Bashan. Basalt is dense, heavy, and nearly impossible to cut with primitive tools. Yet the cities of Bashan were shaped from it with precision. Massive stone blocks stacked into walls so thick that battering rams would fail. Gates so large that ordinary men would struggle to move them. These structures were not defensive by accident. They were designed for inhabitants of great strength and size. Archaeological remains in the region still show doorframes taller than normal, thresholds worn smooth by heavy footfall, and foundations laid to support extreme weight. These were not homes built by giants. They were homes built for giants, and fear followed them. When Israel heard of Og's cities, fear spread quickly, not because Israel doubted God, but because they remembered. Their fathers had seen giants before. They had heard the reports from the land of Canaan, and Bashan represented the last place where that nightmare still lived. Og's cities were not only physical strongholds, they were psychological weapons. Each wall whispered the same message. You do not belong here. But God's command to Israel was clear. Do not fear him, because walls cannot protect what God has condemned. The 60 cities of Bashan were not signs of permanence. They were signs of delay, a final refuge built by a bloodline that knew its time was ending. And soon, those walls would face something greater than giants. They would face judgment. The confrontation was inevitable. Israel could not enter the promised land, while the last giant king still ruled in the shadows. Og of Bashan did not hide behind his walls. He marched out to meet Israel. Scripture tells us that Og and his entire army advanced toward Edrei, choosing open ground for battle. This was not the action of a desperate king. It was confidence. Og had never been defeated by men. He trusted his size, his strength, his cities, and perhaps his bloodline. But something unusual happens in the text. Before the battle begins, God speaks directly to Moses. Do not fear him, for I have delivered him into your hand. This command reveals the truth. Israel was not facing a giant. Og was facing judgment. The battle itself is described with striking simplicity. There is no dramatic duel, no heroic struggle, because Scripture does not glorify giants. It records their end. Og, his sons, and his entire army were struck down. Not slowly, not partially, completely. Every city fell. Every stronghold was taken, no remnant remained. This was not conquest, it was eradication. The Bible emphasizes that Og was killed with all his people, leaving no survivors. This detail is critical. Because the war was not about territory, it was about bloodline. Og's death marked the final collapse of the Rephaim kingdom. The last giant king fell not because Israel was powerful, but because the time of giants was over. God had already judged this corruption once in the flood. Now he closed the chapter completely. The iron bed remained, the cities were emptied, the land was reclaimed, and Bashan, once a stronghold of giants, passed into human hands. Og did not fall to a greater giant. He fell to a God who does not share his creation. One question lingers longer than the battle itself. If Og was a giant, if his bloodline was forbidden, why was he allowed to live at all? The flood had already wiped the world clean once. Yet centuries later, Og still ruled. The Bible does not explain this directly. Judgment in Scripture is never random, it is measured. Og's survival was not mercy toward giants. It was patience toward humanity. Every generation that lived under Og's rule witnessed the same truth, that strength without righteousness leads only to destruction. Bashan was allowed to stand as a living warning, a reminder of what happens when boundaries between heaven and earth are crossed. And there is something else. Og did not hide in rebellion. He ruled openly. His kingdom was visible, his cities known, his size undeniable. There was no excuse left for disbelief. By the time Israel arrived, the evidence of giant corruption was undeniable, and so was God's authority over it. God waited until Israel was no longer a group of slaves. He waited until they had law, covenant, and leadership. Og was not defeated by chaos. He was defeated by order, by a people who knew who their God was. And perhaps most importantly, Og's fall marked a transition from a world still echoing with pre-flood corruption to a world fully handed over to humanity. After Og, giants vanish from Scripture as rulers. Their age ends. Og lived long enough to be seen, and fell at the exact moment he needed to be remembered, not as a legend, but as a lesson. Og was gone, his iron bed remained, but empty. His cities lay in ruins, and Bashan, once a stronghold of giants, entered a new chapter. The land itself remembers. Scripture and later traditions hint at the lingering presence of Og's kingdom. Even after his death, Bashan was no ordinary land. Its hills were haunted by legendary bulls, powerful, untamable beasts associated with the strength of the Rephaim. Its valleys whispered of spirits and shadows, the echoes of giants walking once among men. Mount Hermon to the north became linked to the Watchers, angels who descended to earth in rebellion. Bashan, nearby, absorbed some of that dark memory, transforming from a physical kingdom to a spiritual symbol of rebellion and divine judgment. The cities Og ruled, fortresses of basalt stone, were abandoned, yet the scale of their construction inspired fear for centuries. Travelers spoke of foundations too massive for ordinary humans. They called the land haunted, cursed, or sacred, depending on the storyteller. Bashan became a cautionary tale, not only a warning of human ambition, but also of celestial corruption, of a time when the boundary between heaven and earth was broken, and giants walked among men. Even centuries later, poets and prophets remembered Bashan as a place of strength and mystery, a land that defied ordinary life. Its rivers, forests, and ruins became symbols in their writings, symbols of power, judgment, and the fleeting nature of giants. And yet, amid all the legends, one truth remains. Og was the last. Bashan's darkness is the echo of a vanished age, its stories preserved not to glorify giants, but to remind humanity. Even the mighty fall, and the earth reclaims its own. Bashan survives as a warning, a place where memory lingers, where history meets legend, and where the last giant king still whispers from the shadows. Og of Bashan fell. His cities were destroyed. His iron bed remained as silent testimony, and yet the question lingers, was he truly the last giant? Scripture calls him the remnant of the Rephaim, but the language itself suggests continuity, not finality. Other giants, like the Anakim, are mentioned afterward, scattered across the lands. Even after Og, whispers of immense men persisted in folklore, oral tradition, and prophecy. Could there have been descendants hiding in the shadows? Or had the bloodline truly ended with him? Some scholars argue that Og's kingdom represented the last organized power of giants, but not the end of all giants' presence on earth. Legends in the region speak of colossal figures appearing and disappearing, of ruins built beyond human scale, and of ancient knowledge lost to time. Og's death may have ended the age of giant kings, but the stories, the echoes, the lingering fear, they survived. And that is the most unsettling part. Giants were real. They walked, ruled, and fought. And even when their bodies fell, their legacy remained in stone, myth, and memory. Perhaps the giants are gone, but their shadow never fully disappears. Og of Bashan, the last king, the final ruler, the remnant of a forbidden bloodline, fell to divine judgment. But in the ruins, in the echoes of the mountains, in the whispers of the valleys, the giants still speak. And humanity is left to wonder, what if some of their kind still walk unseen among us? The giants are gone. Their cities are empty. Their kings are dead, but their story remains etched in scripture, carved in stone, and alive in our imagination. Og of Bashan was not just a king, he was a warning, a reminder that even the mighty fall when the time comes, and that some mysteries, no matter how old, never truly fade. Og fell. His cities were erased. His name survives only in scripture. But giants did not disappear quietly. They faded into ruins, legends, and forbidden memory. And if Og was the last giant king, then his death marked the end of an age humanity was never meant to inherit. Or was it?